Good day. Happy Thursday. Barely squeaking this in the morning, but we'll make it work. I wanted to, as you can see from the graphic, it's not just my standard finding something that's a nature scene and just sort of throwing it up there. I wanted to talk about a document that had come out a number of months ago that, or I should say, it was popular a number of months ago. It is actually pretty old. It came out in 2010 originally. But it had different scenarios that the Rockefeller Foundation, something like that. Yeah, the Rockefeller Foundation had put together some different scenarios to try and talk about what the future might look like under those different scenarios. And it got a little bit of attention because of the lockstep. And I just want to read the high level description of each of these different scenarios, because while lockstep got a lot of attention, none of the other three did. And there's one in particular, which again you can see on the screen by my biased opinion, that people should have been paying attention to that they did not. So the first one, lockstep, they summarized it as a world of tighter top-down government control and more authoritarian leadership with limited innovation and growing citizen pushback. And part of the reason that people latched onto that narrative is because of how it started out. So I'll read the opening paragraph from the lockstep scenario, and you'll get a good idea why people keyed in on this one. It says, in 2012, the pandemic that hit the world the world had been anticipating for years finally hit. Unlike 2009's H1N1, this new influenza strain, originating from wild geese, was extremely virulent and deadly. Even the most pandemic-prepared nations were quickly overwhelmed when the virus streaked around the world, infecting nearly 20% of the global population and killing 8 million in just 7 months, the majority of them healthy young adults. The pandemic also had a deadly effect on economies. International mobility of both people and goods screeched to a halt, debilitating industries like tourism and breaking global supply chains. Even locally, normally bustling shops and office buildings sat empty for months, devoid of employees and customers. So again, lockstep, the tighter top-down government, the way that they dealt with this scenario was through computers, through video cameras, through dealing with all sorts of stuff. There's a section of these different scenarios where they talk about the life in lockstep, or philanthropy in lockstep, or technology in lockstep. And so, those things are interesting to read, and they help understand, or help you to understand the nature of the direction that they're trying to go with this. And the thing is that if you remember, I talked about how technocracy is propaganda. So there's this idea that through technology, people are going to be able to build this sort of one world government that's going to make everything work just fine. But what we're seeing is that the algorithms, the AI, and all that kind of stuff, while it is certainly very powerful, it's nowhere near as powerful as the people who want to try and put out this impression that they're going to control the world. They need it to be. They're still needing those AIs, those algorithms, those things to be improved. And in the meantime, they're trying to get everybody to act as if they do have control, they do have power, and self-censor, so self-regulate, and for people to act as if they have that power and control, even when there's clear evidence that they don't. One of the things that hints at the fact that they understand this gap is that if you look at entertainment, entertainment is quote-unquote their territory. The same people who are going to try and control the world are going to control how people are entertained, because the entertainment is going to be how you slip programming in under the radar. People think, oh, it's just a movie, oh, it's just a TV show, oh, it's just a comic book, when in reality they are actually digesting complex ideas that are abstracted from the real world just enough for them not to realize they're digesting complex ideas. And what we see in all sorts of dystopian narratives, whenever we look at the future, what we see is that as much as there is oppression through technology, the same technology gives people an out. The same technology that the the future dystopian governments use to try and control everybody, there are people who are smart enough to be able to use that technology to their own benefit. And that's part of why I want to insist on technocracy being propaganda, because the thing is, you look at history, technology and education and all that kind of stuff has worked against centralized control as much as it has worked for it. It might benefit in the short term to consolidate power, but the long-term sustainability is detrimentally affected by power. You can see this with weapon design. So a country or a nation of people come up with a new weapon. They use it in order to consolidate power, but as soon as the cat's out of the proverbial bag and other people can back engineer that technology and use it for themselves, the edge is gone. And now that new technology, instead of being something that sets them apart, it's now the new playing field. That's what the new basic is. Everybody needs to be at least at that level, if not beyond it, in order to keep playing the game. So right now what we're seeing is that the same companies that are trying to push the technology angle are influenced by diversity and inclusion. And this is counterproductive because you can't have refinement without discrimination. Even if you do not accept evolution, let's just use the framework for a second with respect to selective pressure. The whole idea that the environment would apply a pressure to an individual, and if an individual exceeds with respect to that selective pressure, then they're going to live long enough to reproduce, whereas if an individual is not well equipped, then they are not going to survive to reproduction. What is happening there is discrimination. So the natural setting is forcing a discrimination between two individuals based on their ability to achieve a certain sort of task. Maybe it's cold weather survival, maybe it's the ability to hunt, maybe it's the ability to digest plants. There can be a lot of different things that play into that, but the basic premise is that in order for survival mechanisms to play a role, you've got to have some level of discrimination. If you look at corporate America right now, discrimination is evil across the board. It doesn't matter on what condition you are discriminating, it is evil, period. And the problem with that is that if you have discrimination as evil, you cannot have the best of the best, the cream of the crop, the ones who are skilled at a particular task or talent in a position of responsibility. You're going to put anybody in there. You're going to put anyone in there because if you were to discriminate on anything, then you're going to get sued and you're going to go out of business and you're going to be in the news and all that kind of stuff. So the same companies that are trying to support and develop all of these advanced technologies are paradoxically constrained from being able to have the best minds actually working on those technologies. And so what you end up with is this is the seed for that dystopian future where, yeah, if you get under the thumb of the government, if you get under the thumb of enforcement and all that kind of stuff, it's going to be terrifying and horrible for you. But there's too many gaps in the system. There's too many ways where people who were excised from the inner circle of the whoever it is that's trying to do anything, from the power and control over everything, these people are now outcasts, and they're talented and skilled and pushed into an environment where discrimination is the name of the game. If you don't know how to do something well, if you can't provide something to somebody, then they're not going to help you and protect you. And, you know, if that means that you're the computer nerd for the gang leader, or you're the guy who knows how to do guns, or you're the cook, you know, whatever it is, you're entering into an environment of harsh discrimination. And so what's going to end up happening is you get really intelligent, really skilled people that are outside the mainstream system that are able to mess with the system. And that's where, again, you know, in all these dystopian stories that we see, it's very rare that the power is absolute. It's terrifying, but it's not absolute. People still fall through the cracks. The ability to project power is no greater than what it is now, in essence. You know, that it's not a one world government. It's an attempt, and they would certainly, you know, the fictional bad guys, you know, the corporatists or the authoritarians and all that kind of stuff, act and talk as if that's what it is. But the reality is that they don't have control over everything. And the tighter they try to grip around everything to control it, the easier it is for people to slip through, especially when the selective pressures are removed from the circumstance, when they want yes men, when they want people who are going to make their lives easy, who are going to tell them that, you know, exactly what they want to hear. And big companies have that problem, and it's really, really difficult to deal with. So anyway, that's the paradox which makes the lockstep scenario from that Rockefeller Foundation document propaganda. This is the narrative that people who are being exploited for political gain are being fed in order to think that, oh, not only is such and such a political group caring about us in the way that their rivals are not, there's this bright new future that we get to look forward to. So as soon as the people that we support take over, we're going to be the ones in power. We're going to have all of this control. We're going to have all of these tools at our disposal. But that's not the truth. The truth is that's the lie being used to keep people looking to the future, to keep them hopeful, when the reality is, as Yuri Bezmenov has talked about in his presentations decades ago, the useful idiots who are fed propaganda, those are the first ones that are shot, because they're the ones that are going to be the most disillusioned when the reality of the circumstance actually hits. When the truth of what they were really building comes out, they're the ones that are going to be the most disillusioned. They're going to be the ones that are the most horrified, and in turn, the ones that are going to be the most vocal against it. So lockstep, again, it's the propaganda being used for the useful idiots, the people who are being exploited politically, socially right now in order for people to consolidate power. And that power isn't going to be permanent, it's not going to be universal, and it's not going to last forever. The other two scenarios, the clever together and a smart scramble that I've called a red herring, are basically them just trying to fill space. Clever together is described as a world in which highly coordinated and successful strategies emerge for addressing both urgent and entrenched worldwide issues. And it's basically just the globalist utopia, and it would be the propaganda, except for the fact that there is a tolerance when you're clever together, which can't exist on the current social narratives. Right now there is no tolerance. The little globe with all of the different colored hands on it, the emphasis right now is not on racial unity. It is not on people getting along with each other, looking past their differences. The narratives are exploiting those differences, driving more attention to those differences in order to achieve something. So the clever together is just kind of that sort of ubiquitous, utopian sort of wishful dreaming where, why can't everybody just get along? So it doesn't really help us to understand what's going on. Smart scramble is described as an economically depressed world in which individuals and communities develop localized makeshift solutions to a growing set of problems. Now this is close to what we're seeing, but it's not quite there, and the reason is kind of subtle in that what the pretense of the smart scramble is that if you see that the little grid, the crossbars and all that kind of stuff, there are these two different dimensions that they try to address in the scenarios where they say, oh, well, with respect to political and economic alignment, the top is strong, the bottom is weak, and then adaptive capacity to the left is low and to the right is high. So what they're saying is that, when people are highly adaptive and there's a disconnect between politics and economics, then the smart scramble is what you would get. And again, the problem here is that it presumes that the existing power structures, when they disappear, that it creates a vacuum that nobody fills. It's similarly delusional in the sense that when power has been concentrated the way that it has and one actor falls, everybody doesn't just fall at the same time. You don't end up with just this destruction of power. It just gets reconsolidated somewhere else. None of the current narratives are focusing on the destruction, whether intentional or unintentional, of power. And so the smart scramble, again, it's a red herring. It's a utopian idea where, if you could just take away all of the power that can be projected through militaries, through weapon systems, through the internet and all that kind of stuff, then you might end up in that kind of a smart scramble circumstance where things are terrifying, but people still have the ability to do stuff locally and really solve problems. And so now we're going to get to the one that I think is the one that should have gotten a lot more attention, and it might become more clear as we go into it. This one is described, the hack attack, as an economically unstable and shock-prone world in which governments weaken, criminals thrive and dangerous innovations emerge. Now, I want to read a bit more out of this one than I did Lockstep, and really just kind of try and unwrap all this kind of stuff. I didn't have all my stuff set up. So, devastating shocks like September 11th, the Southeast Asian tsunami of 2004, and the 2010 Haiti earthquake had certainly primed the world for sudden disasters. But no one was prepared for a world in which large-scale catastrophes would occur with such breathtaking frequency. Frequency of large-scale catastrophes. Keep that in mind. The years 2010 to 2020 were dubbed the Doom Decade for a good reason. This document was originally come out in 2010, so there's a lot of stuff that they had predicted which were fantastical and fictional, but for the purpose of making the narrative. So the years 2010 to 2020 were dubbed the Doom Decade for a good reason. The 2012 Olympic bombing, which killed 13,000, was followed closely by an earthquake in Indonesia, killing 40,000, a tsunami that almost wiped out Nicaragua, and the onset of the West China famine caused by a once-in-a-millennium drought linked to climate change. Not surprisingly, this opening series of deadly asynchronous catastrophes, there were more, but put enormous pressure on an already overstressed global economy that had entered the decade still in recession. Massive humanitarian relief efforts cost vast sums of money, but the primary sources, from aid agencies to developed world governments, had run out of funds to offer. Most nation-states could no longer afford their locked-in costs, let alone respond to increased citizen demands for more security, more health care coverage, more social programs and services, and more infrastructure repair. In 2014, when mudslides in Lima buried thousands, only minimal help trickled in, prompting the Economist headline, "Is the planet finally bankrupt?" So, here's the thing. Look at 2012. What's something that could easily be said about 2012? We have had breathtaking frequency of large-scale catastrophes. Remember, we started out at the beginning of the year with Australia on fire. Now we've got Corona and all of the fun that's going on with that. And we've got states that are dealing with literal anarchy. We have Black Lives Matter and Antifa. We have China beginning to beat the drums of war. We have all of these things occurring in a very short period of time. So instead of being spread out over a decade, we're seeing a lot of dramatic events occurring within a very short period of time. And it's coming from every single angle. What we're also seeing is that, for example, with Corona, there's a really huge pushback in the public narrative about whether or not it was engineered, but that's the whole thing, is that this hack attack talks about how technology is used by companies, by governments and everything. So there's biotech being used to wage war. So, they talk about, so one of the paragraphs reads, the Wild West environment had a profound impact on innovation. The threat of being hacked, and in the presence of so many thefts and fakes, lowered the incentives to create me-first rather than me-too technologies. And so many patent thickets made the cross-pollination of ideas and research difficult at best. Blockbuster pharmaceuticals quickly became artifacts of the past, replaced by increased production of generics. Breakthrough innovations still happen in various industries, but they were focused more on technologies that could not be easily replicated or re-engineered. And once created, they were vigorously guarded by their inventors or even by their nations. In 2022, a biofuel breakthrough in Brazil was protected as a national treasure and used as a bargaining chip in trade with other countries. Verifying the authenticity of anything was increasingly difficult. The heroic efforts of several companies and NGOs to create recognized seals of safety and approval proved ineffective when even those seals were hacked. The positive effects of mobile and internet revolutions were tempered by their increasing fragility as scamming and viruses proliferated, preventing these networks from achieving the reliability required to become the backbone of developing economies, or a source of trustworthy information for anybody. A source of trustworthy information for anybody. And then, of course, they have some of their mainstream narrative stuff. Increasingly, not all the hacking was bad. Genetically modified crops and do-it-yourself biotech became backyard and garage activities, producing important advances. 2017, a network of renegade African scientists who would return to their home countries after working in Western multinationals unveiled the first new range of GMOs that boosted agricultural productivity on the continent. Yeah, not going to happen. So anyway, I want people to look at that hack attack scenario and realize how much of that is already happening. What we saw with the response to COVID is that a lot of the equipment we got from China wasn't very effective, or it was falling apart, or it was broken, or it was infected with the very virus that the test kits were supposed to be testing for. What we see is that deception and the use of technology to undermine and participate in international subterfuge is considerably more common than one world government stuff. We see these technologies in the United States, we see YouTube, we see Google, we see the power that they have, but because everybody's sort of stuck in the internet in so many different ways, it's hard to see how little impact they can have outside of the internet. Sure, we hear horror stories and all that kind of stuff, but again, the frequency and the quantity of those horror stories about the power of the government and the power of these different multinational organizations, it's meant to shock and scare. It's meant to present an image of power and control, which is, again, that propaganda from the lockstep. But it's not real. There are people who have controversial opinions that are still employed by companies that have committed to rooting those people out. There are technologies being developed that are being used in warfare that countries don't even want to admit. If you look at what's going on with coronavirus, again, the evidence that it has been engineered and that China knew more than they have let on would support that scenario specifically. That there is deception, that there is lying, that there is nobody really in control of anything, and everybody's just fighting to do their best to control what they can, and they're doing it through technology, they're doing it through again, intelligence work and all that kind of stuff. So this morning, this has been an extremely long one. I don't think I'm going to be able to do these kinds of things very often. But I want you to look at the hack attack. Again, look at the scenario it lays out and realize that the criteria, the events that they're talking about, are just a prompt for the conversation